Hello, everybody. Welcome. This is the first session for the pre-convo conversation around a secular age in anticipation of Andy and Kara Root coming to our synod or coming to our bishop's convo. So as we gather, I'd like to invite people to put their locations and churches in the chat so that at least we can get a sense of who's in the room today. That would be really, really helpful. And then as you're doing that, I'm gonna see, I think everybody on the call is from the synod, but I have a friend who saw this on Facebook. And so I'm just gonna invite my guest, or at least to just kind of recognize him, Jason Talsness. Jason, where are you from? What synod? He's in Guatemala right now for some kind of medical mission. I think he's having a hard time with this.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I serve in the Southeastern Synod, which is 4 states, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, and Mississippi. And I serve in Savannah, Georgia, Messiah Lutheran Church. My bishop is Bishop Kevin Strickland, and I'm on a medical mission trip at the moment in Guatemala. So delighted to be with you, and thank you, Dr. Hahn, for including me.
Yeah, we were classmates. It's always fun to connect. Well, welcome everybody. I just want to also just start with the sense of familiarity with the secular age, or at least the conversation. You put in the chat, let's say on a scale of like 1 to 5, how familiar are you, with 5 being super familiar and 1 being hardly at all? A secular age, Andy Root's work. Love to just get a sense of where people are. I know they have the surveys, but I didn't put one together. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Great. Some 3s, 1s, 3s, fairly familiar. Good. That helps us to get a sense of who's in the room. Thank you. Okay. So just some words for introduction. As we go along, please you can put questions in the chat as they come up and kind of mark your questions. We can come back to those, or you can interrupt and we can have conversations along the way relative to where we happen to find ourselves. I imagine that this first session is going to generate a lot of questions, and some of the questions we might engage, and others we might kind of push down the road for other sessions that kind of tee up other different topics that kind of work out and expand from there. So just want to say that we'll say that when we come to it. Let's see. Anything else that we need to say for today? Bishop Shelley, can you please open us in a word of prayer? Uh-oh, I can't hear you. Even though you're unmuted, I don't know why.
How about now? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, there we go.
Okay. Always a question when you're somewhere else. It's good to see you all. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Thank you. Let us pray. Gracious God, we come with many feelings in our hearts and many things happening around us. We ask that as we breathe in your spirit, that we also breathe in your hope, your sense of calm, and your desire to show love as you love us. We ask in this time together that your wisdom would be shown, that we may learn from one another, that we may be excited to collaborate and dream with one another, and that we may prepare for the time when not only will we be together on screens, but we will be together in person in just a few weeks as we gather for Bishop's Convo. We thank you for Dr. Hahn and for the work that he is already doing, for Annette, and for all the work that the Bishop's Combo team has been doing. And we pray that you continue to be with Andy and Kara as they prepare to come. Thank you for all you give to us, especially your son, Jesus, in whose name we pray.
Amen. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen for the PowerPoint. And I'm also going to ask and invite someone, maybe Andy or Bishop, if you could monitor the chat for us. And of course, you can all just unmute yourself too and speak up, but with respect to questions. So I might not see them when I share my screen here.
To do that.
So. Okay.
Could I ask a question, David? Would you have a preference for people to do a chat or just ask, or what would you prefer?
It doesn't matter to me whether people put it in chat. Sometimes my thinking is that if we put it in chat, maybe somebody just wants to put it in there, but not interrupt the flow of the conversation. And so, something might be answered a little further down. And we can also return to it at a later point. Just by means of introduction, myself, I got introduced to a secular age and Charles Taylor when I was doing my PhD work at Luther Seminary. And I think we read this probably in one of my seminars in 2010, 2011. And it was probably, of all the books that I read at seminary, this and the ideas within it has probably shaped my understanding of mission and church and faith and God and being pastor in congregations than any other book. It has helped me to understand things that how people situate faith and belief. And it's also helped me to get a sense of oftentimes how we miss what we think we should be up to. So I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I've just been so grateful for additional voices who are navigating this, and just we'll bring those forward in just a second. In terms of today, what I'd like to do is just basically introduce the three types of secularity that Charles Taylor articulates, just so that we can kind of get a grounding in what he means by that. And so that's kind of what the goal is. That's where we're going. There will be, I think, anticipated questions that will lead to other sessions and other concepts and language that Charles Taylor is identifying. And we'll get to those in the next session. So I just don't want to jump ahead. So today's goal is just the three types of secularity. I remember when we were in Minnesota before moving here, Casey had a colleague at a church, and consistently he would tell me, this is probably 2010, 11, 12, he would consistently tell me, Dave, I really have no idea what I'm doing as pastor. I can do pastoral functions really well, preaching and teaching, and I'm probably pretty good at funerals and memorial services and pastoral care, but administration. But with respect to faith formation and what it means to do that kind of work in today's world, I'm really confused and I'm lost, and I feel like I'm just shooting in the dark. And the more I've been, in relationship to colleagues and pastors and friends and churches, I feel and see that same kind of aimless, both direction, but then also a longing to do better, to be better, but not always understanding what that means and how we ought to engage that. So what occasions the conversation today, of course, is Andy and Kara Root. I would say that Andy, more than anyone, has really popularized a lot of Charles Taylor's material, popularized it in the sense of these first three books. This is a series, the Secular Age series. It was from Erdman's. It was actually intended to only be 3 books. So, so that he wrote 6. He just kind of didn't stop. And I think he's just trying to always then take what he understands and integrate it into the life of the church and where the church finds itself in any particular moment. So the first three, of course, faith formation, the congregation, and pastor in a secular age, those really kind of are his ways of taking Charles Taylor's work and then integrating them into the life of ministry from those various perspectives. These other pieces, let's say innovation, is a really interesting one, by the way, where he's critiquing how innovation itself functions within the lens of a secular age and the self that's actually like conditioned in secularity. And that's a whole other conversation, and we won't get into it, but I'll say that's a very interesting kind of approach given our enamored kind of understanding or appreciation for what innovation can be. And the newest one is the mysticism piece. And he did some really interesting work there. And I can give you podcasts to listen to so that you can go back on your own and listen to them to continue to kind of engage and get a sense for what he's doing as we anticipate meeting with him. And finally, the one that's probably the most accessible is When Church Stops Working. A lot of us have started to read that, if not read it already. And we did a book study ourselves on that about a year ago. And yeah, I will say that's okay, not the best for me. I don't think it gets into some of the details as well as what he's talking about in terms of some of the other books and what he does otherwise. But this is his material that kind of animates Charles Taylor. I want to also bring in Kara Root and recognize her contributions. She and Andy, they're both Presbyterian pastors. Andy went to Princeton. He is, of course, the children, youth, and family, kind of the youth guy over at Luther Seminary and youth and culture. And Kara is a Presbyterian pastor in the Twin Cities. And in many ways, I think because she's married to Andy, she's probably just married to continuing education. She is absorbed and immersed in that whole, I think, conversation. But these two contributions are really interesting and much more accessible than I think anything Andy does. The deepest belonging is great narrated 3 stories around what this looks like working out in the life of her congregation. And so those stories I think are really helpful about naming the dynamics of what this ministry can look like in a very constructive way. And then receiving this life, she then offers and looks at various practices. And practices and postures, by the way, are really important kind of terms or ways of approaching the times that we find ourselves. So these practices, I think, are really helpful. Again, constructive approaches to how to navigate in the times that we find ourselves. And finally, I want to introduce James K. Smith. If you don't know him, he is a professor of theology, philosophy, religion at Calvin College. He's a really interesting guy, but he does a phenomenal job as well of articulating and really easy, at least in my ears, to listen to. He does a fantastic job of communicating and articulating what Charles Taylor is up to. He wrote his own version of a book that is like intended for seminary students or, educated folks in the parish who would like to a little bit more challenged in understanding. So how not to be secular. But I just wanted to call your attention. For me, Andy and James are kind of the most popular figures that I'm aware of. Sure, there may be others out there, but they're the ones that come to mind for me. So who is Charles Taylor? Charles Taylor was born in 1931. He is a Canadian philosopher. He's also a Catholic. And so he is writing out of his place of faith as a Catholic and as a practicing Catholic. He is very much interested in thinking around through the lens of like philosophy, political theory. So it's very interdisciplinary in terms of his approach and how he's coming to think about what secularity means. One of his books previous to Secular Age is called Sources of the Self, written in 1989. And Sources of the Self gives you a sense of one of the primary themes of the text, which is what does it mean to be an enlightened person, a self in today's world? And how have we been conditioned to be persons living in the world? And then how does that impact how we think about God, faith, life? So Sources of the Self is kind of a precursor to this bigger contribution. So that's a little bit about Charles Taylor. It's like 91, I think, at this point. So getting to a secular age itself, and this is kind of just the beginning of the intro here for us. This entire 800-page tome is really all set up to answer this primary question that he starts his book with, which is, why was it virtually impossible not to believe in God in 1500 in Western society, while in 2000, many of us find it not only easy, but even inescapable? And so he's asking the question, again, primarily from the West. So that's his kind of starting point, which is really important to recognize, that he's drawing on how the Western configuration of belief has formed over 500 years, to the point where 500 years ago, people just kind of unconsciously, it was just so much a part of culture. They believed, it was just inundated in their world, whereas now it's a choice, and it's a choice among many. So he's asking the question, how did we get from there to here? And that's his attempt to kind of explore. And for him, then, this exploration of the transition is really historical, philosophical, social, cultural, drawing on a lot of different kinds and approaches of backgrounds, philosophically, cultural, anthropology. But he's asking about the human condition from a time, again, when belief in the transcendent, it's really important, was the default, where now it's become one option among many. So there's this transition that's happened that's profound in the modern experience in the West, and it challenges traditional notions of faith, identity, and the nature of the self. So what I'd like to do is go through the three types of secularity, but before that, really kind of name what's called secular zero, or, life before secular one. And what is that characterized as? So secular zero, kind of that pre-modern era, and this is all thinking about how belief functions. Secularity, of course, as the word, as multivalent, like there's a lot of different ways in which we define the term secularity. But there are some characteristics of this zero secular that are important to highlight. And there are three here that are listed and that really help to encapsulate it. One is the enchanted world. Things in themselves are supernatural, and porous selves. And so this sense that that the world is enchanted has a lot to do with the sense of meaning and its construction. That is, if you think about Lord of the Rings and those movies and how enchanted the universe is in that world, that the trees come alive, that the creation is very much interacting with the humans in a variety of different ways, and there's wizards and there's magic. I mean, that kind of imagination. This is another term that he uses, by the way. It's called social imaginary. So our imaginations are socialized. And within this culture and time, there was an enchanted worldview where your imagination was that not only were you making meaning, but meaning was actually being made by all these other things outside of you. And so in this instance, you can think of like even the role of Eucharist and what that played, and how like serious people took taking the Eucharist, to the point where it had so much power that it could actually affect you in profound ways, to the point where some people in medieval times would take it and then they would actually take it out of their mouth and feed it to their animals, thinking that that was going to heal them. And it's that kind of sense that things in themselves have supernatural power. And that was kind of attributed to their belief. So enchanted worldview, things in themselves have supernatural power. You can even think of relics. Relics functioned in this same way, that they had supernatural power. So you can imagine in the West, big cathedrals were built around promoting and highlighting these relics, with the sense that they have supernatural power in and of themselves. The porosity, or the porous self, has to do with how oneself then works or lives in relationship to this world that's also making meaning, how it's impacting me. So it's not only what we would call like unidirectional, as if like as an autonomous individual, I'm working, out to the world. The world is working on me. And there's a porosity there that speaks to what it means to be a self in this world. So those are some of the characteristics that speak to that. Yeah.
David, there's a question. Zero considered pre-modern?
Yeah. I'm sorry, you're breaking in and out.
Bishop, let me do it, since he could probably hear me better. So the Bishop was saying that there's a question in the chat. Would secular zero be considered pre-modern?
Yes, pre-modern, for sure. And did somebody say something about Luther or Reformation? Or no?
I don't think so.
Okay, yes. Yeah, secular zero is pre-modern. And in many ways, it was kind of the pivot point is, Reformation. And after Reformation is what's happening in the Reformation actually lends itself to the effects that we find ourselves in currently. And so that's kind of a significant pivotal point, but it's something that slowly happened over time. But yes, this is like pre-modern. So let's go on to the next piece. This is what's this? This is, yeah, so porous to buffered. They call it buffered in the opposition, and this is where we find ourselves now. We can explore this more if you'd like. But again, the medieval worldview, the porous self was understood as open and vulnerable to divine and supernatural forces, in contrast to modern buffered self that's seen as closed off and autonomous and disengaged from such influences. And so there's a variety of reasons for that, but that's kind of the nature of what it means to be a self in medieval time versus an understanding of who we are today. So the ways that we think of secularity, I'm going to suggest that for the most of us, we think secularity 1 and 2. And that's what we're going to explore right now. That we'll get to the third one. But predominantly, secular 1 and 2 is when we think secular, that's what we're operating from, and that's how most people are thinking. Secular 1 here is the public-private split. It's when the division happens between the church, kind of the religious domain, and public life. So there's a disentangling, or some write about it as a disestablishment. This is called and considered maybe the first disestablishment, where education, politics, the economy, social life kind of starts to get disentangled from religion. And there's this moving to belief primarily within the sphere of private life and not necessarily public life. So this happens over the course of like decades and centuries, but this is the first understanding of what configures that split. But one of the things that Andy Root talks about in this first secularity, and we're going to listen to a little clip here, is that he says that if zero modern, kind of pre-modern secularity is relative to things in themselves and the supernatural power, he says there's a shift from things to will, and to the agency of an individual having a kind of will that has its own agency apart and really in isolation from the things out here. But that has implications then for how we have been in our church. One of the things that Andy argues is that it's from Secularity-The that denominations themselves have actually developed. Denominations have developed with respect to preserve this reality, to preserve the religious life that might be challenged from the other public domains. And so it was a way to perpetuate, to maintain its own identity alongside of those other domains that were growing. And so I just want to highlight about 4 minutes here and get your thoughts either on the other side or we can keep going. But I don't think he ever anticipated us as the audience for this talk, but it's interesting. So I'll just play it. Let me know if you can't hear it.
We start to see that what's important is not things themselves, that things aren't enchanted with meaning and significance, but what matters now is wills. Will you will to be part of this? Will you will that going to church is something significant for you? Will you will, even though you're only 14 or 15, will you will for the rest of your life to be a Mennonite? Will you decide for that? Will you will to be part of this congregation? Wills become very important. And this becomes really significant. This holds on with us. If you are part of denominational leadership, this is huge. Every denominational official knows that the denomination, as a kind of modern institutional structure, can only exist for one more generation. And what I mean by that is if the next generation does not will to enact their life in that denominational affiliation, it will not exist. This is why in the denomination my school's part of, the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which sociologically is not an evangelical group, but it's so confusing. Just go with me here. But every 3 years they have a thing called the Youth Gathering. It's a big event where they bring all the young people of the ELCA come to it. It's usually in a big dome event. There's 20,000 people at this thing. The denomination, someone could get the numbers on this, but it's something like the annual budget for the youth gathering that only happens every 3 years is $3 million. $3 million. And that doesn't even include how much local congregations have to raise to be able to take a group of young people, which they start raising money 2 years, 3 years in advance for this thing. Now, why do they do it? Why do they actually do it? They know that that's a lot of money, but it's a good investment. Because if the next generation does not decide to enact their lives as Lutherans, there is no Lutheran church. So I was at one a few years ago, and it was like day 3. It was in San Antonio at the San Antonio, what is that called? Thing called the San Antonio Dome? Is that what it's called? The Alamo Dome. Thank you very much. There's a Spurs fan around here. It was at the Alamo Dome. It was packed, and it was like day 3, like I said, and the kids were buzzing. And it's usually a big production, rock concert-y kind of thing. And these 2 high school girls were in front of me, and I just happened to be walking behind them. And one of the girls was walking with her friend, and they were friendly, having a great time together. And one of them did the whole thing where you kick your friend without them seeing it, you know? So she kind of slyly kicked her, and the other girl knew right away that she kicked her, and she kicked her, and she looked at her, and she did this is her exact word. She looked at her and she said, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe you just kicked me." She wasn't Kim Kardashian, but close. And she's like, "I can't believe you kicked me." And then she said these words. She said, "That's such an un-Lutheran thing to do." And I was blown away, and I kept thinking to myself, un-Lutheran? An un-Lutheran thing to do. And I thought, what do you mean? What does she mean, un-Lutheran? I mean, if her friend would have turned to her and put her arm around her and said, "Hey, I just want to tell you, whatever they're saying in there, we're justified by our works," that would have been un-Lutheran. But she just kicked her. That's an un-Lutheran thing to do, she says to her. And then I realized the denomination got exactly what they wanted for their $3 million. That this is the sense that these girls were in such the glow of this that they got the main point of the event. The main point of the event, and if you did, I haven't done this, but my guess is if you did research, if you did qualitative research, even quantitative research, and ask young people their biggest takeaway from this event of seeing this dome of 20,000 people, what they will say, their biggest takeaway is, I never knew there were so many Lutherans. Now that isn't insignificant. That's very important. $3 million important? But it's necessary for the denomination, because if the next generation does not will to be Lutheran, there is no denomination. Now, I'm just...
Okay. So, I just want to say that, there's probably other reasons and benefits that come from the National Youth Gathering, but it's just interesting what he names in that, and we can talk about that. We can push him on it when he comes and say, hey, what were you talking about? But it's kind of interesting for the wills and how that functions within our church and our tradition. So secular 2, from religious to a-religious, this again is probably the most common sense of what we mean by secularity. Here, what we're really talking about is the notion that, again, the drive or motivation is how people get committed to this. Their belief is from belief to unbelief. So there's all sorts of energy in this, in the sense that that the real crisis is people falling out of faith and not believing. And so there's this motivation, of course, that we have to look for resources, and the resources are the primary things that help to kind of help people to exercise their will within our religious space, but that they can believe once again. And so this is where even in, can somebody mute? I'm just going to mute people here as they're talking. In his book, When Church Stops Working, he really pushes on this a lot, and it's some others that the two primary concerns that function within churches is an anxiety is that churches really feel that they need to be more, they need more resources, and they need to be more relevant. And so he's actually challenging that, and that those two interests primarily are rooted in secular 2, with a motivation and a drive to help people to believe once again, having been pushed out of unbelief or as a religious people. So what you see here in secular 2 is this setup where believing and unbelieving are in opposition to one another. I think that's where secularity has really been understood and most commonly kind of framed. But if that was only the case, we would always be trying to convince people then to believe again, because they fell out of belief. But Charles Taylor has a completely different argument than 1 and 2. And so that's what leads us to the bigger issue of Secularity-3. And Secularity-3 has to do primarily about the notion that the contesting and the fragilizing of all belief. Like that's the thing that we find ourselves in the secular age. The contesting and fragilizing of all belief. So this is where the power of doubt has crept in. And so we find ourselves, whether it's ourselves or our parishioners, we find ourselves thinking or saying out loud, do I really believe this stuff? Or was I just grafted into this because this is a family I was born into? Is faith in God really, really true? Or is this whole thing just a trick? Is it just a projection of our own will to power? Or is it just something that somebody came up with years ago and now we're somehow subscribing to? But I don't know if I really believe this. So perhaps this whole notion of God's reality is just another way to construct meaning. But it's just one meaning among others. And so I'll just live within it. And because I like community, I'll just come to the church and be with other people. But whether I believe in God, I don't know about that. So Do you see the sense of like the weight of what like secular 3 holds? It's the contesting and the fragilizing of all belief. And the thing is, this functions for all people. That is, it's not just for believers. And that's another really key piece to all of this. That the contesting and the fragilizing of all belief is that beliefs are haunted and fragile. But this works, as I said, both ways and for all belief systems. Theists, atheists, and agnostics are always being tempted to the other side. Always tempted to think, maybe I don't have it right. Maybe there is something else. And we find ourselves in no matter where you are in the system, what belief you hold, there's a contestation of that way of holding belief, the doubt that creeps in. Let's see here, what else? Yeah, there you go. So back to Taylor's central question. Why was it virtually impossible not to believe in God in 1500 and in Western society, while in 2000, many of us finding this not only easy, but even inescapable? Let's see, I want to go back to let's see if I have notes here. Yeah. One of the things that we need to think about with respect to this is the role of transcendence and eternity. That when the self is actually moving through the time of the Enlightenment, that what Charles Taylor is arguing is that the self has become so autonomous and individualized that they become the constituting like agent of their own, of constructing their own life and their own meaning. And what has happened, and he challenges in some ways what's known as the subtraction method. And the subtraction method, he moves in contrast to that, and I don't have a slide for it, but the subtraction method is this, that in modernity, there was this belief in God, belief in the transcendence. But then when science came into the, the rational kind of the order, right? The age of reason, where reason became the order of the day, not just transcendence. There was a shift in gaze from God and the transcendent to the natural. And that shift in gaze to the natural, and with respect to the individual, then like being able to scientifically monitor that or name that, there was a disconnection, a subtraction, both in terms of one's gaze to the transcendent, to the natural, and then from eternity to the present moment. And so there's that big shift then. And one's way of finding life in the world, one's way of configuring belief was all placed upon the individual. And how the individual then constructed its own meaning was kind of completely disentangled from anything outside of oneself having any kind of authority. And so any transcendence as having authority became suspicious. And the only thing that you could trust was yourself. And that's kind of known as the subtraction method. Well, he's taking that, Charles Taylor, and he's actually saying that it's not like the transcendent or belief doesn't exist. But what he's naming is that now there are multiple beliefs that coexist. And there are multiple different ways in which one can configure and take the place. It's almost like a replacement of the divine. And so there's the sense then that now it's not just about, right, how do we move from 1500 to 500 years later to now, where faith in God was just the thing that you did, to now it being one choice among many. It's that kind of reorientation where the individual is the one that constitutes all of that meaning making, and any transcendence or eternity is completely shut off. But it doesn't shut down like God or belief. It actually creates multiple options among many. And that's the kind of stuff we're going to talk a little bit about more next time. But just to kind of bring an end to this and some conversation to open it, he says, rather than focusing on individuals who lose faith, Taylor is most interested in understanding how the conditions of belief themselves have changed. Like, how is it that belief and what people find believable is no longer as it once was? So it's not about whether you believe or you don't, that is, you lose faith. It's the conditions of what counts as believable. So that's just kind of a highlight of the secular 1, 2, and 3. Again, there's other concepts and categories that we want to play out because there's implications then for what Secularity-3 is actually creating. And I'll just give you a sense of some of that language now. We won't go into it, but what's called an immanent frame, what's called exclusive humanism. Yeah, those are some key concepts that are, and what's known as the Nova effect, the splintering of multiple opportunities. He uses that as a metaphor. So we'll get into that next time. But I just want to say this is an intro to the conversation, and we've got some time for just wondering together around, implications, curiosities, what stands out to you, what additional questions do you have, what are you noticing? You see this in your place? Yeah, and I'm going to stop the sharing and then we can just talk among ourselves. Any thoughts?
Well, I kind of think that there's trends to go back to an enchanted world view right now, especially in the creation care movement, where we really listen to our Native American sisters and brothers a lot and siblings a lot, and they claim a different worldview and more, life also in Mother Earth and in things which we would not consider a life. And then there's those court cases where personhood is applied to rivers or landscapes, and I guess that's a reaction to giving them also to companies and industrial entities. But while you were talking, I was just thinking, well, something is turning right now again, I think, in that area.
Yep, I think you're right. I think that's a really interesting piece to highlight and to name, because I've thought about that too, especially being out here in Seattle. Yep. One of the things that he brings this up in his, and I'll share this with you. One of the things that Andy Root brings up in his podcast with Homebrewed Christianity, Trip Fuller, about his mysticism book is that, and yet still, belief is one option among many. So it's true that there is an enchanted world, but how belief itself is situated is still determinative of individual agents saying this is how it's going to be. So it's an interesting, the question around secularity is it's now one option among many. So that you think about, how do we attend to a pluralistic society and where multiple beliefs function at the same time? And so this actually would be a really interesting question for us to engage with him around, I think, in our time together, which is how do we account for or understand this awareness of enchantment that we're noticing, especially in the Northwest, with respect to secularity. Yeah, Jessica.
Can I want to test if I'm understanding this by comparing it to some another study, which is like the Baskin-Robbins effect. Does anyone know this? It's they studied that people who went to ice cream shops that had all the flavor options, like anything you could want, Baskin-Robbins, all of them, versus people who like went to an ice cream shop with 6 flavors, that the people were more satisfied with their choices when they had less options because they had gotten so overwhelmed and there was so much like what ifs about, well, maybe I should have gotten that other 32 options from Baskin-Robbins. I kind of see that applying with this of if the point is that the overwhelming nature of choice of living in a pluralistic, interfaith, multi-faith society, pushing us out of it or leaving us less satisfied with the choice that we do select, which then leads us to opt out.
Yeah, exactly. And what I would say in addition to the choices, it's that the belief itself is contestable. Like every single thing that we hold is contested. And that sense of doubt, like we don't, there's nothing, see, this is a problem with fundamentalists or our conservative, like evangelical fundamentalists, because they are overly certain and they have a foundation on which they build everything. And, you know, there aren't too many people like that. You know, I guess there are a lot of people, but I mean, the sense is how belief itself is contested is that we hold doubt, whether we talk about it out loud or not, that we have the doubt because of those choices. It causes us to have doubt, and then we don't really have something that secures us. There's no security to faith, to what it is that we can really stand on. And I think that in many ways is the challenge. So yeah, the choices that are available are because of the doubt that creeps in, or it can go both ways maybe. Yeah. Other thoughts? Yeah, Tormod.
I was thinking that, oops, I'm sorry, someone else?
Yeah, I was just kind of, tying in what you were talking about there, David. Conditioning of our faith. And I wonder, well, what I hear from a lot of people who are unchurched or de-churched anymore, it ties in with the fundamentalist viewpoints or having been told what to believe. And we live in a multicultural, multi-belief kind of world, and people don't want that. And that's where I also feel the Christian nationalism movement has been very damaging to the Christian movement overall, because it's been politicized. So it becomes very, very hard, I think, for some to even consider if there's a different message.
Yeah, I mean, it just perpetuates the kind of doubts that are out there, and people are suspicious of it. Yeah, I think it's true. Sorry, somebody else was going to connect. Yeah, Wilma.
I was thinking that the way that the secular world has evolved, and specifically in our society, where we have become extremely individualistic, and I mean, the autonomy has led us to become individuals in the sense, basically islands, where we continually say that we do not need one another. I've been reading, of course, I've been reading this author among many other Catholic authors, and they speak of the importance of community, church as community, the importance of, because the human being will always look for community, the human being will always look for one another, especially during times of crisis. And maybe I am not white nor American, I'm Hispanic. And one of the biggest challenges for me in this culture when I decided to move this way was to live in a society where that was not like mine. Mine is very family oriented, where we stand up for each other, almost tribal like. And yet, many of these things we're seeing now in Puerto Rico because of the influence of the United States over us for so many years. And yet, we still maintain and want to fight for community and for that communal identity. I don't know, I haven't read this book in particular, so I don't know if Charles Taylor speaks to that in this book.
Yeah, say that again. Speaks to
the importance of community against to go against its individualistic and autonomic tendency.
Yeah, I don't know if he's looking for solutions as much as he's just problematizing and identifying the place that we find ourselves according to that question, right? So how did we go from, not just believing and then to multiple choices of believing? He's just trying to trace that argument. But as a good Catholic, of course, I think, I think very much he is interested in the body of Christ, sacramental theology. I think it's very much connected to it. But he also is connecting and thinking as a philosopher in terms of language and linguistics. And so, Protestants tend to be the language folks, the word people, and Catholics tend to be the body people. And but all embodiment moves to language, or else we couldn't find each other and be in community. And so it's just an interesting thing. Yeah, Shelley.
Thank you. What Wilma was talking about, I think that there is that complexity that not only is there just this array of ice cream flavors for us, but there's also the sense that I'm the one who has to choose this without being in community with someone to help me in that. And I'll just share, this is my moment of vulnerability for you all, is that I was meeting with my spiritual director last week, and I was explaining an issue that was going on in my life, and then she said, well, how did you resolve it? And I was really proud of how I resolved it. I'm like, well, I did this, and then I did this, and then I did this, and I was like, and then I came out of it, and then I was able to go on, was basically my thing. And this is what she said. She said, wow, that seems really lonely, the way you explained that. And I thought, oh, I thought I did a great job because I came through it, and I think that that's part of the Western culture part too. I think that I think Wilma's naming one of the things that's really that in this age that we are as church combating against. That not only if we've become so individualized that our own faith has become so individualized, it's like, well, I have this faith and you have that faith, that there's just no way to be together and to share in each other, mutual consolation, to share in the burdens, to move forward, right? So thank you, Wilma, for bringing that up this week.
Thank you. Anna?
I was just kind of wondering and I'm sorry I had to take that call and I missed what Secular-The was. So I'll have to go back and hear the part that I missed. But in this, I was just mulling over this shift from an enchanted worldview into this more disconnected view, and just
it's disenchanted.
Disenchanted. And it's kind of just interesting how some of us never got out of the enchantment. I mean, I realized that I have grown up and I am still in the enchanted worldview in many, many ways. And I don't think that's just because I was Catholic, but it had to do with a lot of things around ritual and symbol and just this sacred way of viewing the world as I realized Okay. Um, just it helps to name things, to recognize why one feels out of sync sometimes, is this, and it is partly in me a tension between the enchanted worldview and the disenchanted, and I keep wanting to like bring back the enchantment, and I realize that it's different than that. We're not going back, you know, we're going into something new. But like, was it Jessica or who brought up about how a creation-centered spirituality is bringing back? Maybe it's more about balancing. I don't know what the future is going to look like, but I recognize that tension in me.
One of the metaphors that one of my teachers always talks about is it's like going on a trip to a completely different place. And we go and we are there for a week or two or a month or 6 months. And we are totally changed by things that are so foreign and different from us. And we have all these amazing experiences. And we come back home and we want to describe to people back home what it is that we went through. But we can never completely, so he calls it a return, but not a return. Like we're returning, but we're not fully returning because we're returning different. And it's like that we have been conditioned within all of these frames. We've been socialized that we return to it in a very different way than we were previously. And so I appreciate that metaphor as like the journey through time, because what it tells me is that, you know, there are a lot of forces and people who are making decisions about how ideas and priorities, values, beliefs function, and it actually shapes us over time. Like, you know, how we speak, our language determines how we think. And we don't even realize that our language sets us up to think a particular way, that it becomes so natural to who we are. Well, in that same way, that's kind of called a linguistic frame. So we would talk about, you know, belief itself is within, kind of by analogy, a linguistic frame of the Enlightenment. And that then shapes how we think. So implications additionally, I think it's interesting, you know, how churches, and we used to do this in my early church too. So I just want to wrestle about some of these things with y'all, because for me, we used to, in confirmation classes, have people write their own confirmation statements, you know, what it is that you believe. And inevitably it was, you know, how is that, you know, not a projection in some ways of their own belief? And what we actually are highlighting is that, you know, they may or may not believe or think similarly, right, to what was inherited or given in terms of our creed is about what God has done. Oftentimes the statements of faith that I hear are about what they do and what they feel and what they think. So they become the center of their statement, sometimes differently. So, you know, the expression, to express ourselves in order to feel ourselves, to know that we have a self. The self becomes the thing that we are preserving. And we want to highlight and this is another word that Andy talks about, is authenticity. He actually pushes against that, or at least names that within modernity or the secular age, that the pursuit is for authenticity. And so it'd be an interesting list for us to push on. I know that there's a hand up, but I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
David, I have to go to another meeting, but I just wanted to also say there's some in chat too, so Beth can go and
Okay.
thank you all.
Great. Thank you. Good to see you. Okay, go ahead.
So I was just thinking while you were talking and others were talking about also in the U.S. Foreign Service, when people go to work in various countries, that there's a certain end result called, which quite literally called going native, at which point a person who is assigned to that culture is considered to no longer be effective in what they're doing. In other words, they become a threat because they have begun to see the world from the perspective of those with whom they have been working and living. And I'm just musing to myself and wondering to what extent the church, as a formation culture, we are forming people, is suspicious of anybody's journeys into other territory. How do we react to that as the church? I'm not asking for an answer. I'm just kind of musing out loud. That's all.
Thank you.
You know, one other little comment, just because I happen to have had probably a deep immersion into the enchanted worldview when I spent a month in southern France and Italy this fall, and I walked on the Camino and like visited sacred places and saw a whole bunch of relics. and you come and you try to talk about them with people and they think that is so ridiculous, you know, like there's this hand that belonged to this saint, or you know, and how people still in some of those, especially the smaller villages, they venerate those and they believe in their power. And it just was a highlight about how the world as a global reality is still quite mixed in these, like, kind of like what Bev was saying about which worldview did you get immersed in, you know, versus the US.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a guy at my gym who was one of the boys of Sudan, and we got to know each other, and he just was really friendly, and we chatted, and he wanted to go for coffee, so we go for coffee. And he came over and has found a home in the United States, and he is now an astrophysicist who works on rockets. And he has we've sat down, and it's just interesting to me. So he grows up in Africa, a certain worldview, and everything out of which he speaks, he's been Americanized for me, because he is talking about, he's writing a new book, and he's writing his new book. He's interviewing Will Shatner and wanting Will Shatner to be the forward, because this guy works for who's the people doing the rockets? Like, is it Amazon, or is it I think, isn't it Amazon doing rockets too? Yeah, or anyway, and what he continued, for me, what I heard, and I asked him, was because everything it's just interesting, like his own, he's a combination of things, is I guess what I'm trying to say. But he is really living out of, in my opinion, a very Western framed sense of personhood. And I can hear that in the way that he's achieving and striving for his life under the values of American culture and individualism. And I mean, and that's contrasted by the fact that he talks about his tribe, and he named at least 15 generations of on his father's side, like off the top of his head. He could just name them. And I was like, wow, that's crazy to me. And so I wonder and ask, you know, how is it that you are, you know, not minimizing, or not, how does that identity continue to play out for you in being in this country? It's just interesting, because in this person, I was seeing an interesting kind of melding of two worlds being played out. And I don't feel it was a helpful description, but that's what I'm noticing. That was interesting.
What was his answer?
He actually was stumped by that. And as a gay man who's in a relationship, he was, really stumped by that. I don't think that he had, I feel personally that I think that that's a part, I almost feel like a part of him has been colonized, and he doesn't understand how colonized he's become. And so it kind of hurt my heart to sit there and wonder about that, you know? But Yeah. So I don't know. It's worth just a more relationship and listening, but I don't know. Other thoughts? Anybody else? Quiet folks? People haven't spoken? All right. Well, thank you for your time. We'll meet, the next time we meet is on, I think it's February 20th. That's the next chat. So we'll tee that up and see how far we get in these conversations. So thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you next time. Have a good month.
Hey,
Yeah, we'll see you
David,
around.
could I
Yeah.
ask you quickly, since I missed that little chunk, this, I know you recorded this.
Yeah, I'm gonna
Is
stop.
it gonna be accessible?